Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we'll take a look at what the Army is looking for in a future attack reconnaissance aircraft, see what South Korea is looking to buy for their military, and sit down with former Secretary of the Air Force Deborah James, with in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis. This is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin. This week, we're going to sit down with former Air Force Secretary Deborah James to discuss both her new book and her time leading the Air Force. But before we do, here's a look at some headlines. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Pentagon's Inspector General has cleared Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan in an ethics probe into his relationship with Boeing, his former employer. A complaint was filed in mid-March against Shanahan, who's been on the job since January 1st. This could clear the way for President Trump to nominate Shanahan to be the full-time defense secretary, which has long been rumored. And the Army has picked 5 bids to design prototypes for its Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft program, also known as FARA. Those selected include an L3 Technologies and AVX team, Bell Helicopter, Lockheed Martin Doane Sikorsky, Karam Aircraft, and Boeing. What's next is that teams will submit their designs and 2 will be chosen to build and fly prototypes. The final selection will fill the critical gap left by the retirement of the OH-58D Kiowa Warrior several years ago. And even though Congress hasn't approved the purchase of new F-15 fighters, Boeing has worked to prep their St. Louis factory for such a buy. The company is investing in the ability to ramp up production from 1 jet a month to 3, as they're continuing to build aircraft for Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But until Congress decides whether or not to fund the buy, it remains to be seen if new U.S. Air Force fighters will be rolling off the line anytime soon. South Korea is looking to buy about $8.8 billion worth of new weapons over the next 5 years. The shopping list for the Asian country includes more F-35s, on top of the 40 that South Korea has already ordered, a fleet of J-STARS type ground surveillance aircraft, and more airborne early warning aircraft to complement South Korea's Wedgetail fleet. In addition, they're also looking to buy electronic warfare aircraft and anti-submarine warfare helicopters. While a major goal is to buy American, some systems could come from European companies as well. And the Air Force's B-1 bomber fleet is back in the air after being grounded for ejection seat problems nearly a month ago. The grounding was because of concerns with the drogue chute system, which allows crew to eject safely from the aircraft. All 62 aircraft are expected to be back in the air soon and are based in both South Dakota and Texas. This was the second fleet-wide grounding in less than a year after an emergency landing by one bomber in Texas due to a fire on the wing. And the Marine Corps is revealing what they want to replace their light armored reconnaissance vehicles, which have been in service since the 1980s. The service is looking for an armored reconnaissance vehicle that is more heavily armored and armed than current LAVs, which carry a 25mm gun. They're also looking to harness sensor fusion technologies to make the new vehicle a hub of information on the battlefield. In fact, one comparison Marine leaders have made is to the F-35, noting its capability to control a battlefield. To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. And when we come back, we'll sit down with former Secretary of the Air Force Deborah James. Deborah James was the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force, serving from 2013 to 2017. She's just finished a book called Aim High, Chart Your Course and Find Success, and took the time to talk with me about the book and her time as Secretary. Here's that interview. Ma'am, thanks for sitting down and chatting with us today about your book. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your having me.
So let's talk about, you talk about leadership. The book is all about leadership. So what do you feel is needed in today's leaders, both in the military and in the civilian world?
I think today's leaders really need to focus on 3 main things. Number 1, leaders today need to be able to chart and navigate the course of their organization. So by that I mean everybody needs a plan, they need to lay out a vision, they need to navigate through the minefields, which will undoubtedly occur, and they need to be prepared to pivot in case the original plan doesn't turn out as they would have hoped. The second thing leaders today need to be able to do is lead and inspire teams, because nothing is accomplished as a singular person in an island. It is always about the teamwork, and leaders will have strengths, they will have weaknesses. The key thing is to play to your individual strengths, but then capitalize on the strengths of the team. The third element is get things done. Just do it, like Nike says. That is to say, achieve your goals. If you can't achieve the full goal, at least advance the ball. Leave the organization in a better place than the place you found it. And make sure that you lead with courage, ethical behavior, top-notch communications to bring people along on the change challenge.
So moving into some of the case studies you look at in the book, some of the 5 issues that you kind of had to deal with the Secretary, was there one that you think was the most important of all those 5 to the service kind of long term?
It's hard to pick just one, but if I have to pick just one, I will say the situation in the nuclear enterprise. And I pick that because the power of nuclear weapons is just so enormous, and it is a top mission of the United States Air Force. I think it's very important that we accomplish that goal, or at least advance the ball toward improving it. So I'll put the nuclear enterprise as number 1.
What were some of the challenges you ran into facing that? I mean, there was a culture problem, it seemed like, out at these bases.
Well, 3 weeks into my tenure, I encountered, I'll call it a scandal within the nuclear enterprise, the ICBM forces, where some of our airmen cheated on a monthly proficiency exam. Now, anything to do with nuclear immediately goes nuclear in Washington, D.C. It's high visibility. And I, as the new Secretary of the Air Force, felt very compelled to get to the bottom of it and to understand the ins and outs personally, not to delegate this one, as quickly as I could. And so I got deeply into the matters, not only of the immediate cheating situation, which was fairly localized, but it uncovered for me a much more broader series of issues that needed to be dealt with.
Do you feel like in the several years since those issues surfaced that they've been corrected and that things are on the right track?
I think things are on the right track from my ability to watch from afar now. I've been out of government for several years. But I do think there were improvements that were realized in terms of people, in terms of readiness. Certainly modernization programs have been launched. We have changed how we train our airmen, how we rate our airmen in the nuclear enterprise. There's more empowerment. So I do think a lot of good change has occurred and that the ball has been advanced.
And so another focus that you made a big push on was diversity within the Air Force, and diversity especially within senior ranks. Do you feel like you succeeded there?
I don't feel that I succeeded fully, but I do think that the leadership perspective, the fact that I talked about it, the fact that I launched initiatives, the fact that everyone knew, the Secretary of the Air Force, as well as the Chief of Staff, that we were on this, that we were monitoring it. I think that did help to advance the ball. And certainly on some of the initiatives, although we were in the earliest year or two of those initiatives, the measurement that we did, for example, the number of women who were admitted to the Air Force Academy and through our officer accession programs generally, that did uptick a bit. So, but persistent focus is needed. The next secretary and the next secretary and the next secretary has to continue to focus on these matters, because if not, so many things have the possibility of backsliding.
And speaking of diversity too, we've had 3 female Secretary of the Air Force and 2 of them right in a row. What does that say to you about the Air Force as a whole when it comes to that?
Well, I think each successive president who has nominated and each successive Senate that has confirmed women, I hope the lesson learned here is that there are very capable women, including in the national security space, who have skills that can immediately be brought to the table. The skills are different for each of us. But I hope the Navy and the Army, that the next president will get with the program and look at a more broad application of women across the board.
So looking back at the Air Force that you left in January 2017 versus the Air Force of today, what differences do you see?
Well, number one, I'm very happy to see that the Air Force, the number of people in the Air Force has grown. When I entered in 2013, the end of 2013, it was a very different Air Force than the one I remembered from the 1990s. It was something like 200,000 people smaller, and we were still on a downward trajectory. I learned very quickly within, say, the first 6 months that this downsizing needed to stop, and indeed I did stop it, and we began to upsize modestly after that. In the years since, the growth has been larger, and I'm very glad to see that, because there were holes throughout our Air Force that needed to be filled. I do think there's been readiness improvements made as well. Certainly modernization continues to proceed, and that's important. And there have been increased technology investments. Of course, there's been more money overall for defense that have been put into budgets in the last several years. And money doesn't solve all evils, but it certainly helps address some of the problems that we were dealing with. dealing with.
And do you feel like the congressional support for that to get that money through with the budget deal was key to that, or was it just more of continued effort across the services leaders?
Congressional support is always key, always key. And if there is one real regret that I have about our overall system is that our politics is still too divided. It's probably more together when it comes to defense than in many other areas, but even in the area of defense, there's far too much drama going on. And if we can just get down to the issue, as I say in my book, get things done. That is ultimately one of the top responsibilities of every leader, and to do it with the least amount of drama and the most amount of support for people.
And speaking of that drama, the Air Force definitely has some debates right now that are ongoing within it, both for its role and its structure. But overall, though, the Air Force, the path the Air Force is on right now, do you think that's a good, successful path for the Air Force? The push they're making to the 386 Squadron push, for example, or the push to get, do you think that's good for the Air Force going forward?
Well, I don't know if 386 is the right number, but growth in the Air Force numbers, units, that's an excellent trajectory. And again, that's the trajectory that was happening in the final couple of years of my time. It's happened even more in the years since I left. I'm not sure they're ever going to get to that level because that is a bodacious goal, but it's a vision. And so growth, I think, is the overall message there, and I'm definitely in favor of it.
Another thing that's kind of riling up Congress a little bit when it comes to the Air Force's future structure is this fighter debate the Air Force is having. Do they buy a fourth-generation aircraft in the F-15E? There's compelling arguments that I've heard from Air Force leadership about it versus putting all their money in the F-35. Where do you see, what's your view there, and how do you see this eventually ending up?
Well, I remember being very surprised when I read about the F-15EX being in the budget, because it's only been 2 short years since I've been out of the government, and I can tell you that that proposal never bubbled up to my level. So if it existed at lower levels within the Air Force or the Pentagon or somewhere, it never bubbled up to me. So I remember thinking, wow, this will be viewed by some as another flip-flop on the part of the Air Force, which is regrettable. It's regrettable because of it, hurts the reputation and it hurts our relationship with the Congress. Now, with that said, the more you delve into it, as you said, there are arguments. It's a matter of capacity, it's a matter of readiness. 4th-generation fighters are not quite as capable as 5th, but they're pretty darn capable, and since we have years yet to go on the F-35, perhaps it makes sense. But still, I'm left with why now? Why under these circumstances? It certainly has thrown I'll say, a shadow upon Secretary Shanahan, because the questions about Boeing have arisen. So I just think it's a shame in the way it was handled. I also recall that the Air Force has really doubled down on the light attack aircraft and doing it quickly, and that this was going to be a lower end solution to be able to deal with some of the terrorism programs that we still have ongoing. What happened to that? So again, these stops and starts, I think, do damage to the reputation of the Air Force, and for that, I am sorry.
So good ideas, not so great execution?
Well, I think it's important to have an idea and stick with it, at least for a while. So the fact that this was such a severe right-hand turn, for reasons that aren't altogether clear to me, although, as you say, there are some compelling reasons, why weren't those compelling reasons talked about a year or two? So those were my questions.
The other big debate in the Air Force right now is about space, and it's national security wide. But the idea of you've been vocal on this in the past. Do you think the current sort of proposals we see, which is a subservice underneath the Air Force, underneath the Department of the Air Force for a Space Force, combined with the eventual plan for a Space Development Agency to be full-fledged, do you think that's the right path for all this?
Well, I am not one who believes that we have a crisis in space. I'm not one who believes that the Air Force hasn't focused on space. I think Heather Wilson has put tremendous focus. I know I did as well. The monies have been increasing over the years for budgeting. So I think it's all coming together, but there is a fervor in Washington to do something to reorganize. So the fact that the President, the DOD now have a proposal, my guess is that it will get in some version approved by the Congress. It won't be exactly as has been proposed. For example, Congress, I very much doubt, will allow transfer authorities and various elements of the Space Force which would loosen the controls of Congress. Congress will want to protect those authorities very carefully. The Space Development Agency, I really don't see the purpose of that, and if there are new authorities to speed things up or new approaches to go faster, hey, let's do that for the entirety of the acquisition community. Why are we just doing it for this new entity, which will largely be a carve-out of existing people who will be called something new? Not fully. There'll be some new people hired, but largely it will be a carve-out. So I don't see the wisdom of that, but they are moving full steam ahead. Finally, I want to say I do support this idea of a separate space command from a warfighting perspective. Interestingly enough, we used to have that.
Right.
But it was combined some years ago with the nuclear element to become STRATCOM, and now pulling it apart. I do think the warfighting focus is an area that we need more of, and a separate command will help us do that.
The other problem the Air Force is facing, not necessarily on the procurement side, it's on the procurement of people, so to speak. The Air Force has made very clear they have a pilot shortage. And the part of that is it's not necessarily bringing new pilots in, it's retention. How did you address that as Secretary when you were there, and how do you feel it's being addressed now and in the future?
The way I addressed it was we did several initiatives. We had several initiatives. First of all, we listened to our pilots and we tried to do more on quality of life issues. I'd say that's the number one reason they cited for getting out. Number two, we tried to reduce additional duties, ancillary training, the types of red tape that our people don't like.
I think one example you had in your book was a treaty compliance officer for squadrons who never had to deal with treaties in the first place.
That's right.
That was quite striking.
So these are examples of reducing red tape which annoy people. The third thing we did was we increased bonuses and the various special pays that pilots can receive. We didn't get all that we wanted from Congress. We got some, but the pays and the special bonuses have been increased. So all of those are still ongoing. Plus, they've recalled some retired pilots into staff positions. There have been some additional initiatives that have happened since that time. Based on what I know, there's been a dent in the problem, but we still haven't cracked the nut, and it is still continuing to plague the Air Force. And as the Air Force seeks to build up, the number of squadrons and whatnot, this is going to become even worse. Overarching all of this, the airlines are hiring. And so there is no way for the United States Air Force to get out from under that competition. So I think there's going to have to be more of everything I said, more incentives, financial incentives to stay, more focus on the quality of life, and continuing to attack these so-called additional duties and the types of red tape that really annoy our airmen.
And this is part of, too, a global pilot shortage, because the airlines are desperate, because you have all these pilots that got out of the military services in the early 90s at the end of the Cold War that jumped into the airlines. They're now hitting their 20, 25 years, 30 years at the airlines coming in. That global pilot shortage, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem for the Air Force generally going forward. Do you think it just needs to train more as well? Just push more people through UPT or other aspects?
I am not fully qualified to talk about this, but I think it is at least worthy of consideration and a look. And that is, are there alternate ways to train our pilots? It takes something like 8 to 10 years currently for the United States Air Force to train and season certain types of fighter pilots. Is there a way to shorten that? So if we can train more people more quickly, but not sacrifice readiness and safety, I think that's a matter worth looking at.
Great. And finally, ma'am, wrapping up looking at all this, the role of the Air Force has always been provide air power and aerospace power for the U.S. throughout. The leadership that you had there, if there's one lesson you could give to someone about what you learned at the Air Force, to a leader in the business community or anything like that, what would it be? One lesson.
The one lesson I would convey to corporate America from my time working with the military is double down on your people issues. I think the military does a very good job of this, and when I say double down on the people issues, it's doing our level best to make sure that the pay and benefits are as competitive as we can make it, taking care of families to the degree that we can, focusing on training and professional development. The military does that far better than most private sector groups that I have been exposed to, providing leadership training, educational benefits. So I think doubling down on people and their opportunities is the key to success in corporate America as well.
All right, ma'am, thanks for the time. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Secretary James's book is set to be available in stores next week. And when we come back, we'll take a look at what those in the government should be asking of their Internet of Things devices. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack offers her latest tips.
A beloved hobby can feel like a mini getaway from everyday life. But what if you could turn that hobby into a career? According to the Small Business Administration, there are more than 32 million small businesses in the U.S. In fact, many service members actually take on business ownership after they transition out of the military. And many of them started with just hobbies. You just have to get started. From the get-go, decide how much time you're willing to dedicate to your new venture. Being an entrepreneur means being your own boss. The effort you put into it directly results in what you get out of it. Then take time to build a strong business plan, as this will be your roadmap for achieving your goals. When you're ready to finance your budding business, talk to a trusted lender about products that help businesses grow. Whether you're looking for partial or 100% funding for startup costs, getting your loan is easier with a solid business strategy. Starting your own business is challenging, yes, but like your hobby, it can be a labor of love and a great way to find your next mission in life. And with preparation, it can be a mission accomplished.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our Early Bird Brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And when we come back, we'll take a look at what those in the government should be asking of their Internet of Things devices. The amount of Internet of Things devices is rapidly growing in the United States, but it brings up the question, what should cyber experts be doing to protect themselves? Daniel Woolfolk takes a look.
Darren, we're seeing more Internet of Things, IoT devices in the government. What are some of the challenges that are out there or that the government might be overlooking?
So it really boils down to awareness that even these devices are present in an environment. And most analysts, when they're defending their network infrastructure, they're not really taking into account IoT devices per se. A big watershed moment for a lot of the industry was when Target was hacked. And the attackers got in through an HVAC system that was bridged onto a commercial network.
It wouldn't be the fifth thing I would even have thought about that would be connected.
Exactly. So now network defenders are having to factor that into how they defend and protect networks, meaning that they need to understand very quickly what these devices are, how they operate, and then how to detect for any signs of an intrusion through those devices.
And your company has Inside Investigator, which is more or less a search engine that'll help you talk to your network, to your devices, and get a little bit more situational awareness.
Exactly.
So what are some of the questions that you would be asking?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you start off just asking basic questions like how many IoT devices are generating network traffic this week, you can kind of see at a glance how your traditional SIM NetFlow data is actually reporting a subset of all the network traffic that's being generated by IoT devices. And this helps analysts focus their attention around the subset of data, of cybersecurity data that matters, again, without having to know the details of what an IoT device is, where is it located, what's it look like. Other interesting things that you can figure out from this data, though, is an IoT device. If you think about a thermostat, you would not expect anyone to directly log in or control it on a typical basis. We can then ask questions like, which users have more than 25 failed logins to IoT devices by user this week. And the idea behind it is that these should not exist on devices that are not really traditional computer systems. These are systems that are designed to be fairly autonomous and require very little control. So if you're seeing attackers target these systems, try to get in, kind of knock on the door, then that's a problem. You might need to add in additional controls or protections to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future.
Or if it gets really, really hot in the office.
Right.
Might be someone on the other.
Trying to change the thermostat. Sure, exactly.
In terms of Internet of Things in the government, what kind of devices are you seeing the government getting more of?
Right. We see a proliferation of standard commodity hardware that's now becoming more smart. So things like badge readers or CCTV cameras. These are devices that you would traditionally think of as on a closed environment, on a closed network, but more often than not, as they become smart, there's value in interconnecting these devices to the standard enterprise fabric. And as soon as you do that, you now have to protect and defend these systems just like any other computer system in the environment.
Are any of these systems straddling unclassified and classified network?
It's possible, yes. We've seen even in organizations that have traditionally classified environments where they will stand up an unclassified network to pull in sensor data from IoT devices that are monitoring or maintaining the integrity of the building.
Darian, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
That's all we have time for this week, but if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Defense News is proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.